The desert sun burned hot over the endless land of the Wild West. The air shimmered with heat, and the sound of distant coyotes filled the silence. On this land, an Apache woman named Nayeli rode her horse with pride. She was known as a warrior of her people, strong in spirit and brave in battle. Her long dark hair flowed behind her as she carried her bow, ready to defend her tribe against anyone who dared to harm them. The West was a land of dust, danger, and survival, and Nayeli had learned to fight since she was a girl. Her heart carried the stories of her ancestors, and she had sworn never to let her people's land fall to greedy hands. But fate does not always respect promises. One day Nayeli and her band of warriors clashed with outlaws who roamed the desert like vultures. These men had no honor. They were not soldiers, not protectors, but thieves who burned homes, stole food, and left nothing but fear behind. The battle came quick, with shouts echoing through the dry land. Arrows flew, gunfire cracked, and horses screamed as dust rose high into the air. Nayeli fought with all her strength, her arrows striking true. She stood fearless like the mountain peaks that guarded her homeland. Yet even the strongest warrior can be overcome when the enemy is many and the ground is unforgiving. As the sun lowered, her body grew heavy with exhaustion. She fought until her arms shook, her vision blurred, and her heart raced like a wild drum. A bullet grazed her side, sending hot pain through her body. Another cut from a blade burned across her shoulder. Her horse, loyal and strong, fell beneath her, and she was thrown into the sand. She tried to rise, gripping her bow, but her legs no longer answered her call. The world around her spun. She saw shadows of outlaws retreating, taking their spoils, leaving only silence behind. Her fellow warriors had scattered, some still fighting, some fallen. Nayeli pressed her palm into the hot earth, trying to breathe, but blood stained the sand beneath her. She thought of her mother's words. A warrior does not fear death. She closes her eyes and walks into the sky with courage. With that memory, Nayeli let her eyelids fall. The desert grew quiet. She believed her time had come. Her chest rose slowly, painfully, and with each breath she felt herself slipping away. She whispered a prayer to the spirits of her people, asking them to guide her. The heat of the desert wrapped around her like a blanket, and darkness took her. But when her eyes opened again, the world was not the same. She was not lying on the hard sand beneath the blazing sun. She was covered with a soft blanket, the air cool and scented with wood smoke. Her body no longer burned beneath the desert heat, but rested in a small room made of wood, with sunlight spilling in through a square window. She blinked, confused, her mind clouded between life and death. For a moment she thought she had entered the spirit world, but then she heard the sound of a chair moving and saw a man sitting nearby. He was tall, with rough hands and eyes that carried years of labor. His clothes were simple, worn from work in the fields. He had placed a wet cloth on her forehead and was watching her with quiet care. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Thomas. He was a farmer who lived alone on the edge of the desert. His days were filled with tending crops, repairing fences, and surviving storms. He had once been a soldier, but he had laid down his rifle long ago. Now he lived a life of silence, far from towns and wars, speaking more to his soil than to men. When he found Nayeli lying in the desert, broken and near death, something inside him would not let him walk away. He had lifted her into his wagon, driven her home, and cared for her wounds through the night. Nayeli struggled to move, her body weak, her warrior's spirit warning her not to trust. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her side and she fell back onto the bed. Her hand searched for her bow, her knife, anything, but they were not there. The man raised his hand gently, not in threat, but in peace. "Don't move," he said in a calm, steady voice. "You're safe here. You were half dead when I found you." She stared at him, her dark eyes filled with suspicion. She understood only some of his words, but she read his face. There was no cruelty there, only quiet honesty. Thomas poured water into a cup and held it toward her. Her lips were dry, her throat like fire, but pride made her hesitate. Slowly, carefully, she accepted it, sipping as her eyes never left his. The cool water ran down her throat, giving her strength she thought she had lost. She looked around the room again. It was small but cared for. Wooden shelves, a table with tools, a fire that burned low in the hearth. This was not the sky world of her ancestors. This was a farmer's home. She had not died. She had been saved. The thought unsettled her. Why would a stranger, a man not of her people, carry her here and risk helping her? In her world, trust was earned with years, not given in a single moment. She felt exposed, wounded, and far from her tribe. Yet she also knew the desert would have taken her if not for this man. He turned back to his chair, sitting quietly as though waiting for her to rest. His silence was heavy but not cruel. He seemed to carry his own wounds, the kind that could not be seen. The hours passed slowly. Naili closed her eyes again, not to die but to gather strength. Her mind returned to the desert, to the battle, to her tribe. Were they safe? Did they know she lived? Or did they already mourn her spirit? These questions pressed heavy on her heart, but her body gave her no choice but to rest. She drifted into sleep. The sound of the crackling fire the last thing she heard. When she woke again, night had fallen. The stars shone outside the small window. Thomas was still there, sitting quietly, his presence steady like the earth itself. He had placed bread and soup on the table, waiting for her strength to return. She realized then that life had not ended in the desert. Something unexpected had begun here in the farmhouse of a man she did not know. Her story was not finished, it was changing in ways she could not yet see. The morning sun poured through the wooden window and filled the small farmhouse with soft golden light. Naili stirred under the rough but warm blanket. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a moment she wondered again if she was caught in a dream. She was used to the open sky, the sound of horses and the voices of her people around her. But here the only sound was the gentle crackle of the fire and the creak of wood as the house settled. She felt the ache in her side and shoulder where the wound still throbbed. Each breath reminded her that she had not imagined the battle. It was real, and yet she was alive because of this stranger. She turned her head and saw Thomas, the farmer, already moving about the room. He had placed a pot on the fire, stirring it with slow patience. His back was broad, his hair touched with streaks of gray, and his movements were steady like someone who had spent his whole life in hard labor. Naili did not trust easily. Her instincts told her to be wary, to guard herself, yet her body was too weak to fight or run. She watched him closely, her sharp eyes noticing the careful way he moved, the quiet respect with which he glanced at her without staring too long. When Thomas noticed she was awake, he set the spoon aside and spoke in his low, calm voice. "You need food," he said simply. His words were plain, but the tone carried no demand. He brought a small bowl to her and placed it on the table beside her bed. The smell of broth filled her nose, warm and comforting. She wanted to refuse, to show strength, but hunger made her fingers reach for it. Slowly she ate, her eyes never leaving him. He did not force more conversation, only nodded when she finished. For the first time since she had fallen in the desert, warmth spread inside her, not just from food but from the sense of safety. Days passed in this way. Each morning Thomas tended to his fields, rising before the sun to check the fences, water the crops, and feed the animals. Naili would hear the sound of boots on the porch, the slam of a barn door, and the distant lowing of cattle. At first she only rested, her body too weak to move, but her eyes followed everything he did. She noticed how his hands, though rough and scarred, were gentle when he worked with his animals. She noticed how he spoke little but carried a quiet strength, a steadiness that felt different from the noise of battle and the shouts of men. Naili's suspicion did not fade quickly. One afternoon, when Thomas brought her a cup of water, she looked straight into his eyes and asked in her own language, "Why save me?" Her words were soft, almost a whisper, and though she did not expect him to understand, she needed to speak them. Thomas paused, hearing the weight in her tone. He did not understand every sound, but he seemed to know what she meant. He looked at her with an expression that carried both sorrow and honesty. "No one deserves to die alone in the desert," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, a shadow of pain, of memories he carried from a past he did not speak of. That night, as the fire burned low, Thomas told her more. His words were slow, but Naili listened carefully, trying to catch their meaning. He had once been a soldier, he said. He had seen too much blood, too much loss, and had chosen to leave it behind. He came to this land to farm, to live quietly, far from war. His wife had died years ago, and since then, silence had been his only companion. As he spoke, Naili understood not just his words, but the feeling behind them. She too carried loss. She had buried friends and family. She knew what it meant to watch someone fall and not rise again. In that moment, the distance between their worlds seemed a little smaller. Over the next weeks, as Naili's wounds healed, she tried to move about the farmhouse. At first, her steps were slow and unsteady, but each day her strength returned. She began to help Thomas in small ways. She would sweep the wooden floor, mend torn cloth, or prepare herbs she knew from the desert for healing. When she walked outside for the first time, the air felt like freedom. The land stretched wide, with golden fields swaying in the breeze and mountains far in the distance. She inhaled deeply, feeling alive once more. Thomas watched her with quiet respect. He was surprised when he saw her skills. One morning, when a horse broke free from its tether, Thomas rushed forward, but the animal kicked and snorted, wild with fear. Naili stepped forward calmly, her voice soft and steady. She reached out, whispering in Apache words, and the horse stilled, lowering its head. Thomas stared in amazement, realizing this woman was not only a fighter, but carried wisdom of the land and animals that he had never known. In return, Thomas showed her his world. He guided her through the rows of crops, explaining how the soil must be turned, how seeds must be placed just right, and how rain, though rare, was prayed for each season. Naili listened, her dark eyes taking in every detail. She had known the wild ways of the land, hunting, gathering, and surviving, but farming was new. She saw in his work a different kind of battle, one fought with patience instead of weapons, with hope instead of fear. Slowly, the silence between them changed. It was no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with quiet understanding. They shared meals at the wooden table, sometimes in silence, sometimes with short words that carried more meaning than long speeches. Naili would tell stories of her people, of the mountains, the rivers, and the spirits of the earth. Thomas would listen, nodding, his eyes soft. In turn, he shared stories of storms that had destroyed his crops, of winters so harsh he thought he would not survive, and of the loneliness that pressed on him each night. Still, shadows lingered. Naili knew the outlaws who had left her for dead were not gone. Their greed would bring them back to this land. She carried this worry in her heart, though she said little. Thomas, too, knew the land was never free of danger. Yet for the first time in many years, both felt less alone. They were from different worlds, different blood. But pain and survival had built a bridge between them. One evening, as the sun set in red and gold across the desert sky, Naili sat on the porch watching the horizon. Thomas joined her, sitting quietly. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Thomas said softly, "You could leave, go back to your people, but you stay." Naili turned her head, her dark eyes steady on him. She did not answer with words, but her silence was an answer of its own. For now, she remained. For now, her path was tied to this quiet farmer and his lonely land. She had once believed she would die alone in the desert. Instead, she found herself beginning a strange new chapter. She did not yet know where it would lead. But in the warmth of that farmhouse, with the smell of bread and the sound of horses in the distance, Naili discovered something she had not felt in a long time. Peace, however fragile it might be. The days turned into weeks, and the farmhouse no longer felt like a place of silence. Where once Thomas had lived alone with only the sound of wind and cattle, there was now the quiet presence of Naili. Her strength returned slowly, but with each sunrise she seemed less like a wounded stranger, and more like someone the land itself had welcomed. She woke early, often before Thomas, and stepped outside to breathe the morning air. The desert, with its endless stretches of golden grass and distant blue hills, no longer felt like the battlefield where she had nearly taken her last breath. It now felt like a place of new beginnings. Naili began to help Thomas more with the work on the farm. Though her wounds were not fully healed, her spirit did not allow her to remain idle. She followed him to the barn, where the smell of hay and horses filled the air. At first, Thomas tried to stop her, worried that she was still weak. But Naili was a warrior. She would not be treated as fragile. She calmed the restless horses better than he ever could. She tied knots with practiced hands, carried buckets with quiet determination, and even repaired a broken fence using skills she had learned long ago in her tribe. Thomas found himself watching her often, surprised by how quickly she had adapted to life on the farm. It was not only her strength that impressed him. It was her patience with animals, her knowledge of plants, and the way she could read signs in the land that he would never have noticed. One morning, when the sky was clear and blue, Naili bent down to study the earth near the fields. She touched the ground lightly with her fingers, then stood and told Thomas in her soft voice that rain would come soon. He looked at the empty sky and doubted her words. But 2 days later, dark clouds rolled in and heavy rain soaked the thirsty soil. Thomas stood at the door astonished, while Naili watched calmly, as though she had known all along. In return, Thomas taught her the art of farming. It was not the kind of knowledge passed down through warriors and hunters. It was a quieter skill, born from patience and trust in time. He showed her how to plant rows of corn, how to care for beans, and how to mend the soil with simple tools. At first, Nayeli thought it strange. How could such small seeds bring life? Yet as the weeks passed, she saw the first green shoots push through the soil. It was not as thrilling as the chase of a hunt or the victory of battle, but it carried a deep satisfaction. It was a fight for survival of a different kind, a battle not against enemies but against hunger, drought, and time. As they worked side by side, their silence became less guarded. Words came more easily, though often they were short and simple. Nayeli told him about the stories of her people, the sacred mountains, the rivers that carried life, the songs that honored the spirits. She spoke of her mother's wisdom and her father's courage. Thomas, in turn, shared his own past. He spoke of his childhood on another farm far away, of joining the army as a young man, and of the battles he wished he could forget. His voice grew soft when he spoke of his wife, who had died years before, leaving him with only memories and a hollow emptiness. Nayeli listened quietly, her dark eyes filled with understanding. She knew the shape of loss. It lived inside her too, but just as life grew calm, shadows began to return. Rumors spread across the land, carried by travelers and neighbors. The same outlaws who had once left Nayeli bleeding in the desert were still roaming the region. They had attacked nearby towns, stealing food and horses, burning homes, and leaving fear behind. Thomas heard the news one afternoon when he went to the trading post for supplies. He returned with a heavy look in his eyes. When Nayeli saw his expression, she knew. She had been waiting for this. The desert never forgot danger for long. That evening, she sat outside the farmhouse, staring at the horizon where the sun sank red into the earth. Thomas joined her, his hat pulled low, his face serious. "They're near," he said simply. Nayeli nodded. She did not need more words. Her spirit had already felt the shift in the air. She knew those men would not stop until they had taken everything they wanted. She remembered their faces, their cruelty, the way they laughed as they caused pain. Her hand clenched tightly. She had once closed her eyes, ready to die at their hands. This time, she promised herself she would face them standing tall. The following days carried a quiet tension. Nayeli began to prepare in her own way. She crafted arrows carefully, sharpening each one with patience. She studied the land around the farm, marking places where traps could be set or where enemies could be ambushed. She showed Thomas how to move silently, how to use the land's shape to his advantage, how to fight not with strength alone, but with wisdom. Thomas, though older and weary of war, followed her guidance. He could see the fire in her spirit, and it gave him courage he thought he had lost. Yet it was not all fear. In the midst of preparation, there were still moments of peace. One afternoon, they worked side by side, repairing the roof of the barn. When Thomas slipped on the wooden beam, Nayeli's quick hand caught his arm and steadied him. Their eyes met for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not the bond of warrior and farmer, not the bond of rescuer and rescued. It was something deeper, born of shared struggle and trust. Neither spoke of it, but both carried it in their hearts. As the days grew longer, Thomas noticed a change in himself. Where once he had lived only for survival, he now found himself looking forward to each sunrise. He looked forward to hearing Nayeli's voice, to sharing a meal with her, to seeing her strength in every step she took. For Nayeli, too, something shifted. She had always been proud, carrying her spirit like armor. But in the quiet of the farmhouse, she found herself lowering that armor. She laughed softly when Thomas made clumsy mistakes with the animals. She felt comfort in the way he shared his bread without hesitation. She felt less alone, but the shadow of the outlaws was never far. One evening, as they worked in the fields, Nayeli spotted smoke rising in the distance. It was too far to be a campfire. It was the kind of smoke that came from burning homes. Her heart grew heavy. She knew the outlaws were close. Thomas saw it too, and his jaw tightened. They returned to the farmhouse in silence, both aware that their days of peace were numbered. Nayeli stood at the window that night, looking out at the moonlit land. She remembered the day she had closed her eyes in the desert, ready for death. Now, standing strong in the farmer's home, she realized she had been given a second chance. She would not waste it. If the outlaws came, she would fight. Not only for herself, but for Thomas, for the farm, for the quiet life they had built together. And so the farmhouse, once a place of silence, became a place of preparation. Two people from different worlds, an Apache warrior and a lonely farmer, stood ready for the storm they knew would come. The West was wild and danger was certain, but together they would face it side by side. The air grew heavier with each passing day. The silence of the farm was no longer peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm. Nayeli could sense it in the way the animals grew restless at night, and in the way the wind carried faint sounds across the desert. Thomas, too, felt it in his bones. He had lived through battles before, and he knew trouble was moving closer. Neither of them spoke of fear, but both were preparing quietly, as if each action was a prayer for survival. Nayeli walked the land each morning, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. She marked the edges of the fields, placing signs only she understood, broken branches, patterns in the sand, to remind herself of where she could strike if danger came. She gathered stones and sharpened sticks, hiding them where they could serve as traps. Thomas watched her with respect, realizing she was not just a warrior with weapons, but a strategist who knew how to use the land itself as an ally. Thomas, on his part, cleaned his old rifle. It had not been fired in years, but his hands remembered its weight. He worked slowly, oiling the metal, testing the trigger, making sure it would not fail when the time came. He also carried extra wood into the house, stored food, and secured the animals in the barn. For every task, Nayeli was beside him, moving with quiet determination. At night, they spoke little, but their silence was full of meaning. Sitting by the fire, Nayeli would mend arrows while Thomas carved new handles for tools. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and though no words were spoken, both knew what the other was thinking. The danger would soon arrive, but they would face it together. One evening, as the sun set in fiery red, Nayeli stood on the porch and pointed toward the hills. A thin line of dust rose in the distance. Thomas followed her gaze. His heart sank, for he knew what it meant. Riders were coming. Not neighbors, not traders, outlaws. Nayeli's eyes narrowed, her warrior spirit rising again. She turned to him and said softly, "It is time." That night they prepared the farmhouse as if it were a fortress. They barred the doors, set water buckets in case of fire, and placed weapons where they could reach them quickly. Nayeli strung her bow and lined her arrows on the windowsill. She moved silently, her mind sharp and ready like a hawk before the hunt. Thomas checked the rifle again, then took his position at the other window. The farmhouse, small and humble, now stood as the last line of defense against men who brought only chaos. The outlaws came at dawn. Their shouts echoed across the land, carried on the morning wind. Horses thundered closer and dust rose high behind them. Nayeli's heart beat steady. She was not afraid. She had faced death before and had been given life again. This time, she was ready to protect it. The first outlaw rode fast toward the house, his pistol raised. Nayeli's arrow flew swift and true, striking the ground at his horse's feet. The animal reared, throwing the rider off balance. Thomas fired his rifle, the sound booming through the valley. The rider tumbled to the ground, scrambling back in fear. The rest of the outlaws pulled their horses, shouting curses as they circled the farmhouse. The fight had begun. Nayeli moved quickly from window to window, loosing arrows with practiced precision. She did not waste her shots. Each arrow struck close, forcing the outlaws to duck behind rocks and trees. Thomas fired carefully, his aim steady, each bullet keeping the riders at a distance. The farmhouse shook with the sound of hooves and gunfire, but inside the two defenders stood strong. Hours passed like this. The sun rose higher, burning the land, but neither Nayeli nor Thomas gave in to fear or exhaustion. They worked together as though they had always fought side by side. When Thomas reloaded, Nayeli covered him with her arrows. When Nayeli shifted positions, Thomas called out to warn her of riders moving close. It was as if the farmhouse itself breathed with their rhythm, holding firm against the storm. The outlaws tried to set fire to the barn, but Nayeli had prepared for this. She had placed water buckets ready and traps hidden near the path. One rider rushed forward with a torch, only to trip on a rope she had tied low to the ground. He fell hard, his torch snuffed in the dirt. Thomas fired above his head, sending him running. Another outlaw tried to sneak toward the back, but Nayeli's sharp eyes caught him. Her arrow struck the ground so near his feet that he turned and fled. By midday, the attackers were tired, their anger boiling into frustration. They had expected an easy victory, but instead they faced a warrior who fought like the desert itself, and a farmer who refused to yield his land. The farmhouse, though small, stood like a mountain in their path. Inside, Nayeli's breath came heavy, her arms sore from drawing her bow. Thomas's shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, yet neither complained. They shared quick glances, silent encouragement. In those moments, there was no difference between Apache warrior and farmer. They were simply two souls bound together by the fight to live. Finally, as the sun began to lower again, the outlaws pulled back. Their shouts grew distant as they retreated, defeated by the strength of two who refused to surrender. Dust rose once more, but this time it trailed away toward the horizon. The land grew quiet, leaving only the sound of the wind and the heavy beating of their hearts. Nayeli lowered her bow slowly. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. Thomas leaned against the wall, his rifle still in hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Thomas looked at her with tired eyes and said softly, "We held them." Nayeli nodded. She felt the ache of her wounds, the sting of sweat in her eyes, but also the deep satisfaction of victory. She had once closed her eyes in the desert, ready for death. Now she stood alive, having defended not only herself but the farm that had given her a second chance. They stepped outside together. The ground bore marks of the battle: hoofprints, broken branches, and scattered arrows. The barn still stood, the fields were untouched, and the farmhouse remained strong. Thomas looked around, then at Nayeli. "This is more than just a farm now," he said. "It's a home worth fighting for." Nayeli's eyes softened. She had lost much in her life, but in that moment, she realized she had found something new: a bond, a purpose, and a place where her spirit could rest. The sun set behind them, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold, as if the heavens themselves honored their courage. And though the west was wild and full of danger, Nayeli and Thomas knew one truth: together they could face whatever storms would come. The land was quiet after the battle. The dust had settled and the echoes of gunfire were gone. Nayeli stood on the porch of the farmhouse, her bow hanging loosely in her hand. The wind touched her hair, carrying with it the smell of earth and smoke. She looked out across the wide desert and felt the weight of what had just passed. For the first time in many months, she was not running, not falling, not closing her eyes for death. She was standing strong, alive, and safe. Thomas came to stand beside her. His steps were slow, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes carried something more than tiredness. They carried pride. He looked at the land, then at her, and said quietly, "We did it." The words were simple, but they meant more than victory. They meant survival, courage, and the start of something new. Nayeli nodded, her dark eyes steady. She had fought battles before, but this one was different. It was not only for her tribe or for honor. It was for a farm, for a man who had given her shelter, for a life she had not expected. The following days were filled with hard work. Together they repaired what had been broken. The barn door had splintered, fences were down, and the farmhouse bore marks of the attack. But every nail Thomas hammered, every board Nayeli lifted, felt like a step toward rebuilding not just wood and stone, but hope. The land, too, seemed to respond. The fields remained green, and the animals returned to their calm ways as though they knew the storm had passed. Yet inside Nayeli's heart, a question remained. She belonged to her people. Her blood, her spirit, her childhood, all were tied to the Apache. She had duties, memories, and bonds she could not forget. As she lay awake at night, staring at the wooden ceiling of the farmhouse, she wondered what choice she must make. Should she return to her tribe and continue the life of a warrior? Or should she remain in this place with the farmer who had given her a new path? One morning, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold, Nayeli made her decision. She told Thomas she needed to see her people, to let them know she was alive. His face grew still, and though his heart felt heavy, he nodded with quiet understanding. "You must go," he said softly. "They need to know their warrior lives." He did not ask her to stay. He respected her spirit too much to hold her back. Nayeli saddled a horse from the barn, and Thomas handed her supplies for the journey. They stood together for a long moment before she rode off. Neither spoke of what would come next, but both knew their bond was not broken by distance. As she rode across the desert, the wind against her face, Nayeli felt her spirit rise. She was not the woman who had once collapsed in the sand, ready for death. She was alive, carrying two worlds within her, the world of her people and the world she had found on a quiet farm. When she reached her tribe, the people gathered in amazement. They had believed her gone, taken by the desert or by the outlaws. Children ran to her side. Elders raised their hands in blessing, and her fellow warriors embraced her with tears and joy. Her mother's words came back to her. A warrior does not fear death. She walks with courage. Nayeli realized then that her courage had brought her not only back to her people, but also back to life. She told them her story, of the battle, of the desert, of the farmer who had saved her and fought beside her. Some listened with wonder, others with caution. But when she spoke of how Thomas had risked his life to protect her and the land, even the elders nodded in respect. They understood that honor could be found not only in warriors but also in those who lived with quiet strength. For a few days, Nayeli remained with her tribe. She shared food, listened to stories, and walked the paths of her childhood. Yet in her heart she felt the pull of the farmhouse. When she looked at the mountains, at the rivers, at the fires that burned at night, she felt love for her people. But she also felt the memory of golden fields, the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of Thomas's steady voice. She realized then that life sometimes offers two paths, and courage means choosing the one that brings peace to the heart. With the blessing of her people, Nayeli returned to the farm. The ride back felt different from the ride away. Her heart was lighter, her spirit clearer. When she arrived, she saw Thomas working in the field, his hat low against the sun. He looked up as she rode in, and for a moment time stood still. The quiet farmer and the warrior met each other's gaze, and no words were needed. She had chosen to return, not because she was bound, but because she wanted to. Life on the farm was not easy. There were still long days of labor, storms to endure, and dangers that lurked in the wild land. But it was a life filled with meaning. Nayeli worked beside Thomas, planting seeds, harvesting crops, and caring for animals. She taught him the songs of her people, and he taught her the patience of farming. They laughed at small mistakes, shared simple meals, and sat together in silence that no longer felt heavy, but full of comfort. Each sunrise reminded Nayeli of her journey. She had once believed her story ended in the desert, her eyes closed forever. Instead, she opened them to a new chapter, one she had never imagined. She was still a warrior, but she was also more than that. She was a woman who had found love, respect, and a place to belong. As the years passed, the farmhouse became more than just a shelter. It became a home, strong against storms, warm against winter, and alive with the spirit of two people who had chosen to walk together. Neighbors who once whispered about the quiet farmer now spoke of the strong woman who stood beside him. Some feared her, others admired her, but all respected her. For in her eyes was the fire of the desert, and in her hands the gentleness of someone who had learned both to fight and to heal. On quiet nights, when the stars filled the sky, Nayeli would sit on the porch with Thomas. She would look at the endless horizon and remember the day she thought her life had ended. Then she would smile softly, knowing that her story had only just begun. The West was wild, full of danger and change, but she no longer faced it alone. She had found strength not only in battle but in love, in work, and in the courage to choose her own path. And so, the Apache warrior who once closed her eyes to die in the desert opened them each morning to a farmer's bed, a farmer's field, and a future she had never dreamed of.